Welcome back, gang. It is the Lambo video bonanza. We just hit 100 subs and we are on our road to 100 million. We are going to, after we hit 100 million, we're going to go ahead and pass PewDiePie and T-Series and whatever Coco Melon is that next biggest channel on YouTube. Can I get some fist pumps? Thank you. Yes. Very consistent posting. This is what I excel at, clearly. And today, what are we talking about? Today, we are talking about the Fahoba Gods core. If you are not hip to that, you might be too young, but Homestar Runner, come on, Fahoba Gods. Like, come on, Fahoba Gods. I say, come on, Fahoba Gods. Everybody to the limit is that, is to the limit, everybody. All right, anyway, we are talking about the Fire, Water, Grass core. This is another very common core, probably the one that everybody knows because when you get your starter Pokemon, they're fire, water, and grass type. And there's some sort of like synergy between the three where they like resist each other's types, you know, like water beats fire, but then the fire resists the grass for the water types, and then that supports. So if you get all three types, then yes, synergy and freaking wonderful. What a great world we live in. But that is it. They defensively synergize pretty well. And again, like I said in the last video, this is meant to be a defensive backbone for your team. So I've seen newer players that are building some sort of whack HO draft team. Okay, and like HO is not my style, but they're like, okay, on my HO draft team, I need to have my Fire, Water, Grass core, and I have Greninja and Blacephalon, and like, let me draft a Roserade, and now I have the core, and now like my matchups are all solved because I have a Fire, Water, Grass core. It's like, okay, no. Like, Greninja and Blacephalon are just going to get steamrolled by everything. Like, these are highly offensive mons. They don't fit into the core archetype of a Fire, Water, Grass defensive core. So, just like last video, let me get out of the way. These are great mons that can fit on teams. And there might be some matchups where you can switch Greninja into something, you know? Like, I've been able to switch Greninja into some Necrozmas and stuff because they run like Photon Guys or Heat Wave. But like, this is not going to be a consistent defensive core for you to use throughout your entire season of draft. So if you are drafting some sort of whack HO team that has all these threats and no defensive switch-ins, first off, I would probably rethink your team. But second, if you're going to do it and you just want to do it, don't draft. Don't bother wasting your time trying to pick up this Fire, Water, Grass core for no reason, unless it's actually going to give some sort of defensive backbone structure to your team. And the last one here, Roserade, is something that can function on a Fire, Water, Grass core, but does not always provide everything that you need from your grass type. It really lacks in physical bulk. It's got decent special bulk, but it doesn't resist ground like a neutral grass type would. So let's go ahead and look at a better one. And this is one that is, I think, really reasonable in a budget. You can definitely get higher tier mons, and I'm going to show you some. I prepared a little bit more this time, okay? I'm a professional YouTuber. I prepared a little bit more to like talk about grass, fire, and what are options for it after I go through the reason for this core and why we have it. But I wanted to give you point options as well. So this, I think, is a reasonable amount of pointage. You know, like Slowbro is high tiered. Arcanine is usually like middle to little above mid tier maybe, and Rotom-Mo is usually a little bit below mid tier or something. So I think that's a reasonable pointage to be able to fit on a team with other sorts of archetypes that you're building, because you want to have this well-rounded team, right? So what do they provide to each other, right? So Slowbro is weak to it's also a psychic type, but it is weak to, because it's water, it is weak to electric and grass. So what resists electric and grass, might you say? Oh, well, that is grass type. So we throw our grass type on the course, and now we have a water and a grass type. What is the grass type weak to? The grass type is weak to two things in specific: ice and bug, It's also weak to other things like poison and flying. And we can try to patch that up with secondary types in the core, and we can take a look at that later when we look at other mons. But yes, two of the things that it is weak to are ice and bug. And how can we patch those up? We can patch those up with a fire type. Then the fire type comes in. Fire type is weak to water and rock and ground. So then we have the water and the grass type that can usually support with those. Grass types should be able to resist the ground types. Water types, usually you would get like a bulky water and they would be able to take some sort of rock or ground type. But remember, every team is different. Secondary types play into this and makes it a little bit more complicated. So you have to look at each team individually and see how can I manage these threats. You know, like don't get too caught up on this needs to be exactly fire, water, grass. This needs to be exactly how we envision it in theory, because once you start building your team, it's going to get messed up due to the secondary typings and the rest of your things on your team, so that you can have other ice resists on your teams to support your grass types as well. So this is just like a good basis structure that will help you resist a lot of threats. So why is this a lot better than the first one? Well, one, Slowbro has Regenerator and it has Recovery. Rotomo has a decent bulk. It's got Will-O-Wisp and it's got Recovery. Arcanine also has Recovery and it's got Intimidate, and it's also got Teleport as well now with Slowbro, and Rotomo can also pivot and all. So they're supporting each other pretty well. This core obviously does not resist a rock type, so you can get in a ground type on your team as well to kind of patch up that weakness, and probably a steel type as well. So then you'll have 2 rock resists on your team still. But like the 3 of them are synergizing pretty well, because Slowbro is also weak to bug, and Arcanine is a really good bug resist, honestly. And obviously you'd have to get some dark and ghost resists on the rest of the team. But Slowbro can honestly take so many hits, very bulky, can get into these other 2 guys, and they can all pivot around really well and support each other's weaknesses with the help of other teammates, obviously. But this is a defensive backbone that you can rely on week after week that are going to have decent matchups. If we go back and look at the bad example, again, really bad, the bad Fahoba God's core, the Blacephalon is like, let's say somebody brings your opponent has Curum, right? And Curum comes out and clicks Ice Beam. Which one's switching into Ice Beam? Where's your Slowbro? Slowbro can at least switch into Ice Beam. You might not be able to switch into Freeze Dry, but at least your Arcanine can switch into Freeze Dry and Ice Beam. Which one of these guys, like even without Freeze Dry, Greninja's not switching into Ice Beam. Blacephalon's not switching into Ice Beam. Roserade's not. You know, Blacephalon can at least switch into bug type attacks because he 4 times resists it, but these guys really aren't covering each other's weaknesses. Roserade can definitely help on the special side if you have like really good physical walls and all, but Roserade is getting mowed down by mowed down. It's a grass type. Nice unintentional pun. It's getting mowed down by earthquakes. It's got terrible physical bulk, and because of its poison typing, it's not resisting ground anymore. So it takes that value away from the course. So these are things that you need to think about, and think about how your team plays into the rest of this as well. So now that we said that, let's go ahead and look at some other fire, water, and grass types that we can put in this core and see how these can work together, and the positives and negatives of each one, right? So Rillaboom. By the way, all these fire, water, grass types are going in the order of like most expensive to least expensive generally. So like if they're similar tiers, I probably didn't bother much, but we're going to start at the more expensive options, and as you go down, it's going to be some cheaper options, and these are not exhaustive. There are plenty of other things that you could put in here, but these are just a couple of things that I looked at and I was like, this is something that I can talk about. Rillaboom, grassy terrain, weakens earthquakes, your opponent's earthquakes, pretty decent defensively. That grassy terrain provides recovery for the rest of the core, and I think it fits better on more BO-oriented teams that don't necessarily want to be switching in tons of times throughout the game, but just need to have a couple of switches here and there to really push the bill and play a more offensive game. So maybe not, definitely not on like a more stally team, but on a more offensive, a thick offensive team, I think Rillaboom fits well. Mega Venusaur is good, but has the same problem as Roserade, where it doesn't resist ground type, but it also is neutral to ice, so that is really useful. So you just need to think about it. Do I have really good other mons to resist ground? And maybe you have Moltres on your team, which is going to be one of the fire types we talk about. Moltres doesn't resist ice either as a fire type, so that kind of screws up that interaction. Neither of them resist ice, but neither of them are weak to it either, and Moltres provides that ground resist. So maybe you can patch up your ice resist with your water type and another thing on your team. So that's something to think about. Shaman, pure grass type, very straightforward, fits the core easily, natural cure, recovery, very bulky, despite being like a tiny grass hedgehog. 100 bulk is really good. As we go cheaper here, Rotom, I already talked about it. Completely immune to ground, so that's a great thing, and super resistant to electric, which is very helpful to teams that may only have this and a ground type as your to electric resist. So might almost immune, but like doesn't stop volt switches and stuff. But so Rotom is very helpful. Also neutral to flying. So another thing that is not completely patched up without dual types is a flying and rock weaknesses. So Rotom is at least a grass type that is neutral to flying. Gourgeist Super and Leafeon, both very cheap picks, but I think they are both very valuable for the money that you get them. Leafeon gets knockoff, and sometimes it can Swords Dance and break a little bit. I think where it really helps is knockoff and wish passing. And Gourgeist is another one that is a fighting resist, very useful. Neutral to bug, also very useful, and just very bulky, especially physically with Will-O-Wisp and Leech Seed and all. So I think those are lower tiers that can actually viably fit into the defensive core of a fire, water, grass. There are plenty of other lower tier grass types that are hard to bring to games. So like, yeah, sometimes like Carnivine is a pure grass type, but like, are you going to be able to bring Carnivine week after week? Maybe you can fit that on your team, and maybe the league is a little bit more fun, so maybe you can work Carnivine into this. But I'm talking more serious formats. You can seriously use a Leafeon, especially because it's so cheap. Fire types. Heatran is one that is like a huge ice resist. Heatran's got some crazy amount of resists. Obviously very ground weak, so you definitely want, you don't, I mean, you can definitely make Heatran Mega Venusaur work, but if you have Heatran Mega Venusaur, you really want to consider your ground weaknesses, because you don't want to have your whole team super weak to, like, I don't know, a Zygarde 10% that just runs through your entire squad. So you definitely want to have maybe a backup grass type or a bug type that can resist the ground moves there. Or really physically bulky water, maybe you can help there as well. Moltres, like I said, Moltres does not resist ice, and then amplifies that rock weakness or the lack of rock resistances, I suppose. So Moltres is very weak. Great with heavy duty boots this gen. That's another thing about Heatran. Heatran is neutral to rock. Moltres is super good grass resist, super good bug resist, and immune to ground. So it has some pretty unique qualities for a fire type, but you also really want to think about rocks and not getting Moltres knocked off if you have a longer match that Moltres needs to wall something with knock, so that can really hinder those kinds of matchups. So just something you want to look out for. Good ice resists as well, because it is not an ice resist. Rotom Heat is something that shares some of those qualities with Moltres, but is better in other ways. It doesn't have the reliability of Roost, but it does still have Pain Split. It does still have Will-O-Wisp. It's not as weak to rock. It's still immune to ground. And yeah, just overall solid mon. Another electric resist for your water type as well. Incineroar is great because it gets Intimidate, and is a dark type, which you always want a dark type to have a psychic immune, and just very generally useful in draft formats, knockoff parting shot. But biggest issue with Incineroar is that your fire type is also usually a source of a fairy resist on your team. So you might have 2 or 3 fairy resists, fire, steel, poison, those kinds of things. So if you're getting Incineroar, you want to make sure that you definitely have like at least 1 or 2 other solid fairy resists. And if you're gonna have 1 other fairy resist, it better not be like a super low tier. Like it better be a high tier fairy resist that you're bringing to every game, because otherwise, like some people's fairy types are just gonna stomp you. So that's something to consider for Incineroar. Scent to Scorch. I think it is very slept on. I think it's got a lot of cool qualities. Lacks super reliable recovery. Still has leech life, but I think this is kind of functions like Rillaboom, where it has a good place on more BO-oriented teams. And honestly, maybe like Scent to Scorch and Rillaboom could work together, because it weakens the earthquakes, and then you have Scent to Scorch essentially resisting a lot of ground moves because it's only neutral. So, and then Flareon, basically all the evolutions can make it on this list because they wish pass. Flareon, I would say, is definitely harder to bring to games than Leafeon is, and much harder than to bring than Vaporeon, because Vaporeon is actually like a solid mon. But I think there's some merit to it, and if you are really pressed on points, like if you've already drafted your entire team and you're like, well, shoot, I don't have a fire type and I really need something. The 2 low tier fire types that I can think of off my top of my head, that you're like, I only have a couple points left. Flareon and Rapidash is also really good. You can have Rapidash as sort of like a pseudo Kartana check. So that can be useful in some matchups, but maybe not something that you can bring every week. So you might want to prioritize getting a better fire type than Flareon, but semi-viable. And then we have the waters, and there are so many waters. There aren't like endless amounts of fire types, right? But like water types, there are so many that you can get. So I just threw down a couple. Azumarill is really cool because it fits well into a Fairy Dragon Steel core. There's another thing later in this list that can do that. So we talked about Dream Cores last week. Azumarill is a pretty solid part of a defensive Fire, Water, Grass. It's also a pretty solid defensive part of a Fairy Dragon Steel. 180 defenses is honestly, it's not bad. Again, it's one of those more BO-oriented mons because it's something that can take hits and dish it back out. But nonetheless, I think it can. I think it has solid defensive utility. Like you wouldn't be afraid to switch it into attacks that it resists at all. Blastoise, another one of those where it doesn't have recovery. Maybe this is something that would be good with your Rillaboom as well, because Rillaboom would provide recovery for these kinds of mons. But it is very bulky and really pushes the bill offensively. Rotom Wash does have a little bit of recovery through Pain Split and Will-O-Wisp and everything. So, and it also provides that ground immunity, so that is super useful. Milotic is something that is very bulky, is going to last the entire game. Can stop a lot of cheesier teams, and just so thick that if you're looking for a team that can play the longer game, I think Milotic is one of those. I think that would fit better on one of those really longer lasting teams. Along with that, I showed Slowbro earlier. Slowbro can also play the long game. Slowbro can play the short game. So if you're looking for a more expensive water that is going to be able to be more adaptive, and you're not going for a BO kind of style every week, I think Slowbro, Milotic, Slowking as well all fit that position really well. Empoleon is cool because it gives, I think Empoleon does two things really well for the core. It obviously it's it's a water type, which provides some useful resistances. It doesn't resist fire though, so you'll have to consider that. But it provides a flying and a rock resist for the trio as well. So when you're thinking through and building the team, if you're like, I need a water type that resists flying and rock, and hey, it's got great utility to knock off stealth rock and defog and all, so it can provide a lot of utility for a team, but you have to consider it's not resistant to fire, it's weak to ground. And honestly, that's it doesn't have great recovery. I would say those are the biggest downsides, but it's got like such water steel, such a great defensive typing that you can pass wishes to it really easily. So that's one of the, you can keep Empoleon healthy in a lot of matchups through that. But it's got great utility in general, and I think that I think it can function as part of the core, but you just really need to think about fire resistances and ground resistances. So maybe something that works well with Moltres, because Moltres is very weak to rock. So I don't know off the top of my head. Maybe you get Shaman, which is ground resist. Moltres is immune to ground. You have Empoleon. Empoleon is another bug resist for Shaman. It's a flying resist. It is a rock resist for Moltres. And these are all like mid to mid-high tier. And so then you have budget to spend on some more offensive high tiers or other sorts of cores there. So also fits in a Fairy Dragon Steel. So I'm selling Empoleon a lot right now, but just something to think about. How do we apply this theory to actually building a Fire, Water, Grass core? And then finally, like a lot of the evolutions, it has Wish. It's bulky. It completely immune to water. So it stops flip turns and stuff, but it can be passive as well. But if you can avoid the passivity, now that it has flip turn, it's a little bit less passive. So that is a great mod. It's a great core to draft. I would say this is not something that you definitely need on every team. I would say mostly there's not ever a core that you 100% need on every team. It's definitely easier to build around these kinds of cores though, because these are tried and true. They generally cover a lot of weaknesses for your teams. But if you are building a more offensive team, if you are covering your weaknesses in a different way, like for instance, if you have like a really, really expensive but strong Fairy Dragon Steel core, the Dream core, maybe you can get away without running a full Fire, Water, Grass core, because that is your main defensive core, and you don't just want to like spend your points for the sake of it just to try to throw this on at the end with all low tiers that you're never going to bring. Not that you'd never bring low tiers, but you just want to think about how it functions into the structure of your team and think about how this functions in the format you're playing. So definitely something to consider. Always play smart and use your noggin. So I will catch you guys on the flip side. Peace out, gamer girls.